Okay, so let's go ahead and move into our conversation today. And as I have the last few days we've done this kind of format, I'm going to briefly review part of what we talked about for the forward market multiple model in this case, and then we'll move into this enterprise value to equity value. So you'll remember that we dealt with multiples. I'm not going to run back through all of that. You've seen that twice now, and you've got the videos and such available. But we have now a model that is not unlike the other models we've used, where we can derive a value using multiples. And we know we can derive a value using multiples just by saying, well, here's a number that is or should be our target multiple, and we're going to multiply that by whatever cash flow variable, EBIT, EBITDA, revenue, free cash flow, whatever we happen to be choosing for this multiple. And you'll have a different number based upon the multiple type you're using. And we can apply that. That's tantamount to this continuing value construction right here. And that is a valuation model. Now, it's a very broad brushstroke model. It makes some broad assumptions. And one of those is that we're going to have an average rate of growth that is constant. The average is constant. Well, you know, we see a lot of valuation analysts do this. We just don't know that it's the most accurate way of doing it, but it's certainly the quickest, and it might get you in the ballpark very quickly. But we know we have a better way to look at valuation. We know we can take the present value of some discounted cash flow plus the present value of some continuing value, and together those are the present value based upon that model form. And in this case, for the forward market multiple model, the present value of the discounted cash flow is the exact same present value of the free cash flow we've used in the free cash flow model, exact same value we used in the explicit period during the KVD model, and it uses the same free cash flow inputs we would see in the explicit period of the APV model when we're looking at VFCF. But because that model uses a different discount rate, then the outcome of this would be different. But it's the same construction. And then we have, for our continuing value, this terminal value construction, and we can then take the present value of that, and then together those are the value. And I gave you the example coming out of the Mira-Dravana example, where if we used a target multiple of 4.25, we ended up with a valuation with our present value of the discounted cash flows plus the continuing value at its present value gave us then a value of 146. Let's go back and talk about this item that I think it was Martin, maybe it was Alex that asked about it a little earlier, and that's the virtue of using 4 1/4 versus the 9.28. Remember, and I'll bring this up for a second. Remember, when we look at Mira-Dravana, we actually could see for the base year, based upon the enterprise value and the EBIT value that we had for that year, we calculated 9.28. I went ahead and used 4 1/4. And I said that I used 4 1/4 because I know something of the industry that this is in, and I would have selected a 4 1/4 multiple. But I'm sitting here staring a 9 1/4 multiple right in the face. Why would I not use this 9 1/4 multiple?
It would be overvaluated.
Well, it's
compared to the other model.
Grossly overvalues. In fact, if we look at it by comparison, we see that using that multiple, we get a valuation of 263.89. So 263.9 instead of 146. Okay, so grossly overvalues it. But why? Well, did anything happen in the explicit period? Did we see any changes there? Well, no. Both of those model forms, or both those models, regardless of the multiple, you see the same explicit period. So we only see it in the continuation.
It's because of the continuing value?
Well, the continuation is what really sees the expansion, right, Martin? And the reason is because a multiple is an inference of growth. So when a multiple is looking at, when we're using a 4 1/4 multiple, we're inferring a much lower growth rate on the company's long-term cash flow than when we're using a 9.25 multiple. So the larger the multiple, the larger the inferred level of long-term growth. Okay.
So would that mean that the 9.28 is completely useless? Like we would never use it?
Well,
like,
I
why
think,
would we bother calculate it?
well, I think you
if
calculate
it's not true.
I think you calculate it because it is a reality at that moment in time, right? I mean, we saw for Marijuana, it has a 9.25. It's incontrovertible. But what does it mean? So now, as we're in the part of our course, we're far more interested in interpretation. What does it mean? Well, what it means is for the moment in time that we saw this enterprise value related to this EBIT creating this multiple, that there was that something had not adjusted. Either enterprise value here had not gone up as we might have expected, or had gone up more than we might have expected, or EBIT had gone up more than we might have expected. Something has changed here that is out of the norm. Maybe it's out of the norm for this company. Maybe it's out of the norm for the industry in which this company exists. Now, if in fact this company has time and again seen this 9, 9.25, 9.5, 8.75, and looking at it year in and year out for 5 and 10 years, then we're not going to ignore it. Even if the industry in which the company finds itself has a 4 times or a 5 times multiple. But in this case, we see that it gave us this 9.25. Well, what does that mean? Well, either we've got a higher value here in our enterprise value, and the enterprise value, remember, came from looking at the market value of the debt and the stocks and such, that as we had shown them. So it either had a higher value there than it should have, or the EBIT wasn't reflective of reality, or something was out of whack. So keep that in mind as we now, in a few moments, as we move through and think about equity values and such. And I think you're going to see some things that reveal themselves here that will support this, and we'll circle back to this because it's an interesting element. Let me go back to the PowerPoint. Well, obviously, the use of the multiple in a model form shouldn't be very difficult for you. The only thing that might be difficult is to identify what is the appropriate multiple, and whether we're using 4.25, 9.25, we're using multiples that we have to think about as being credible. And we know we can look at our company's history, such as when we think of the 9.25, we can look at comparables in the market, we can look at aspirational targets, and we've talked through all of that. So that's the forward market multiple model. And most often when you have a model like this, you will have multiple iterations of it. So when you look at one of the later problem sets, you'll see that I have you actually give us 3 forms of this model at lesser than expected multiples, higher than expected multiples, and at an expected multiple. So it forms a range of values. Any other questions about this model form and how we're getting here?
One question I have is do we ever like, why don't we just calculate the multiple using the equation and just putting the G in to be equal to what we did for like our free cash flow and KVD?
Okay, well, that's a good question, Jade. In fact, it's one of the 4 options. So when in the PowerPoint deck where I showed you the 4 options, it was historical, it was target aspirational, it was comparable, and then it was equational, where we might actually use the equation for that multiple and then plug everything in, including our growth rate, and get what we think the multiple ought to be. So we would look at that. Absolutely. We might accept it, we might reject it based upon our interpretive skills and based upon what we think of the company and what that infers. But we'd absolutely take a look at it. Yeah. By the way, most valuation analysts don't do that because most valuation analysts aren't aware that there's an algebraic construction of that multiple. They may have seen it somewhere, but they've never used it. Okay. But it's a worthy example.